Hello, I'm Mark Beasley. I'm an MD at Shakespeare Martineau and also our Responsible Business People lead. And welcome to this very special edition of SHMA Talks, where we have 4 of our people from across the firm who are here to talk me through some of their personal experiences of openly identifying as members of the LGBTQ plus community in the workplace in 2021. Hopefully they'll explain how we can all become better allies, as well as why we should talk more about the subject. So as we strive as a firm to be a more inclusive workplace, we believe it's very important that we have these conversations to help improve our knowledge, to remove some of the potential concerns which are always created by that lack of knowledge, and to increase awareness and understanding so we can become better allies to our friends, colleagues and communities, and to hopefully make future conversations feel just that little bit easier and more natural. So welcome to Gareth Hegarty, Kerry Russell and Matt Parr, all of whom are legal directors with us, and Jack Randall, who's a trainee. So without further ado, first question. There's a common misconception that you only have to come out once in your life, but I've certainly heard that on many occasions. People have said they've had to come out lots of times, continue having to come out with every new person they meet or in very different situations. Were any of you afraid or apprehensive to openly identify as LGBTQ plus at work? And if so, why? And I'll come to Gareth on that one, please.
Thanks, Mark. Yeah, picking up on what you've just said, I think I've probably come out in my life probably close to 1,000 times. Society kind of still somewhat has a default setting of assuming people are heterosexual. So whether it be in work or in my personal life, there's always that kind of not awkward moment. Like in my own life, I've got to the stage where I'm quite a confident member of the LGBTQ plus community. So it doesn't actually faze me to kind of correct whether it be a client or a colleague that I don't necessarily have a wife. I probably am. I'm still looking for a husband, for want of better words. But yeah, at the start, particularly in my career, I was apprehensive. It's not the easiest thing to do, to kind of shift from the default position to let people know that you aren't, for want of better words, the norm. But as time goes on, it gets easier. And I'm quite fortunate in that I've been in the firm a long time, so most people know me. So most people know my own personality, so I don't have to try and reinvent the wheel anymore. But yeah, as a junior member,
does it feel easier now, Gareth, than it did before?
The firm definitely, yeah. The firm with the More in Common initiative a few years back, it actually, I think it was a real shift in our firm's kind of culture, and actually just allowing people to be not even necessarily in the LGBTQ plus community, but actually across the spectrum. I thought that was what was pretty impressive about the initiative. And I'm talking, I know there's other people in this call who was actually probably more involved in the initiative, organizing it, but I actually benefited from it. I was actually on the ground. And I think the ethos in the firm changed massively in the last few years. So yeah, in the last few years, it's become a lot easier just actually to be who you are.
Good. Kerry, do you want to add anything to the initial question about the coming out question?
Yeah, I mean, like Gareth, I think as a gay person, you come out all the time. It's not necessarily coming out, because I always think you do that with close sort of family and friends and people who know you, and you kind of say, right, okay, I've got to tell you something about me. But you do, like a hairdresser the other day asked me, what does my husband think of XYZ, and you just have to kind of keep correcting people. But I can't get too mad about that, because it would be better if people were more neutral and asked, what does your partner think about this, or use sort of gender neutral terms like they rather than he or she. But ultimately, I think I accept that most of the population does normally have a straight relationship. That's just the way that life is. Not everybody is gay, and I think it just takes a little while for people to get used to a different way of speaking and a different kind of way of connecting with people. I've probably done it exactly myself. I've probably done it where I just assumed somebody was straight, and that's wrong. I don't do it anymore. I try not to do it anymore. But in terms of, my experience of coming out, I definitely did not. So I started working at our firm as Harvey Ingram way back in the day, back in Leicester. And I was a bit reluctant to tell people first, because I just wanted people to get to know me and not make any sort of any judgments about me. And then as I got sort of further on and then settled in with the IP team, I told the guys there that I was getting married and I was going to have a wife, and I was actually a little bit shocked about how little they cared. That, you know, they were just kind of like, okay, fine, and that's brilliant. That's really, really, really good, because you don't want anybody to make a big deal out of it, because I wouldn't make a big deal out of a guy getting married to a woman. I kind of say, oh, that's, you know, good for you, well done, or whatever. So yeah, it took me a while. Nowadays, I think we're the firm is in a much better place, and I really, really hope that there are people out there who identify as LGBTQ+, who just know that, you know, you might not feel yet in your immediate team that you can be open, but you can be open, and you can speak to other people. There's allies in the firm, everywhere in the firm, and I know all of us guys on the call now would be more than happy to kind of guide somebody through that process.
And I think equally it's important that they don't feel under any pressure to make any decision, because I think it must be it must be a very personal decision, mustn't it, in terms of timing. I think it's a very good point about the assumptions people make, because I think often certainly my perception is often they come from a very good place. It's just societal norms, in inverted commas, where you do make that assumption. And I think it's one of the reasons we need these sorts of conversations, so people are educated, really, because I think in a lot of cases it's not the intent to offend or say anything out of order. It's just almost a normal conversation where you know people, I bet you get quite a lot of, if you challenge it, quite a lot of people, almost a spluttering and, oh sorry, I didn't mean to, da 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 da. It's but we shall see. So right, Jack, you're the one that's done your exams most recently. A bit of a technical question here for you. What do each of the letters in LGBTQ stand for, and what do the words actually mean?
Okay, yeah, that's
2 marks for each.
So the acronym LGBTQ+ is the acronym for lesbian, gay, bi, trans, queer, questioning, and ace. So taking each of those in turn, lesbian refers to a woman who has a romantic and/or sexual orientation towards women, but also some non-binary people may also identify with this term. Gay refers to a man who has a romantic and/or sexual orientation towards other men. But it's also actually a generic term for lesbian and gay sexuality, and some women define themselves as gay rather than lesbian. And also, again, some non-binary people also identify with the term gay. Bi is an umbrella term, and it's used to describe romantic and/or sexual orientation towards more than one gender. Trans is, again, an umbrella term, but this is used to describe people whose gender is not the same as, or it does not sit comfortably with, the sex that they were assigned at birth. Queer is a term used by those wanting to reject specific labels of romantic orientation, sexual orientation, and gender identity. Questioning is the process of exploring your own sexual orientation / gender identity. And finally, ace, again, is an umbrella term used specifically to describe experiences of a lack of, or varying, or even occasional experiences of sexual attraction. So those are all of the letters of the LGBTQ+ acronym.
It is quite complicated, particularly as you get to the right-hand side of them. So I got involved in a conversation not so long ago with somebody that had lots of different letters and symbols beyond that, and there seemed to be some antagonism towards, you know, is it generally accepted that do people generally say LGBTQ+, or is there a bit of an argument within the various communities as to quite what that should say? Or do any of you?
I think most when they say LGBT, I think a lot of people assume that to mean the whole spectrum of letters. Yeah. I mean, we're not here to test anyone. It's a bit of a tongue twister in itself, and I do think that genuinely LGBT is something that people widely accept to mean LGBTQ+, and all of the other letters on the end of it. But that's certainly how I perceive it.
Good. So now you've said the word spectrum, you've copped for the next question. So talk me through the colours on the Pride flag and how that's evolved over time.
So the Pride flag is just over 40 years old. It was developed in the late 70s by a guy called Gilbert Baker. Originally, it had 8 colours to it, and each of them did represent certain something. It was designed to effectively be a symbol of pride in the LGBTQ+ community. Hot pink was designed to represent sex. Red was designed to represent life. Orange was to represent healing, yellow was to represent sunlight, green was for nature, turquoise was for art, indigo was for harmony, and violet was for spirit. So they in themselves are a bit of a mouthful, but in the sort of early 80s, early 90s, mostly due to production issues, actually, because they couldn't produce the color pink very easily. It wasn't often in stock in flag makers and so on. So they cut it and they replaced indigo for blue, and they got rid of turquoise as well. So now it's the more traditional 6 colors. They still mean the same thing, but there's a couple that have obviously been edited out of it. And then in more recent sort of LGBTQ plus history, it's been developed again. So I think it was Philadelphia. They started using the black and brown stripes in it to represent people of color in the LGBTQ plus community. So then all of a sudden we were back to 8 colors. And then recently, I think it was in 2019, the Progress Pride flag was developed, which incorporates a sort of triangle on the side. And they again have represented or incorporated 3 new colors, which is the light blue, white, and pink. And they represent the trans community. And the black and blue have sort of taken another sort of angle to represent those with disabilities and those that have died from HIV/AIDS in the community as well. So all in all, there's about 3 very widely used flags, but there are dozens of others. I certainly won't sit here and go through them all, but there are lots that represent different smaller communities within the LGBTQ plus community as well.
Yeah, I remember Kerry. I think the first time I saw the trans flag was Kerry was putting some flags up for Pride Month at the time, probably a couple of years ago now in the office. And I couldn't help but think it was all pastel. It seemed quite pastel shades from memory, and it was put against the Pride flag. It did look a little bit understated, but hey ho, yeah. Yeah. So moving on. Kerry, I think you've probably answered this a little bit earlier on, but I'm still going to ask in any event. Sometimes women are described as gay as well. Is that an acceptable term?
Yeah, for me, yeah, it's totally acceptable. And in fact, it's probably the term that I use the most because it's a shorter word than using the word lesbian. So yeah, I think it's acceptable. For me, it's acceptable. And I think everybody's completely different, so everybody will have their own ways of identifying. I quite like the term queer as well, just because it makes it sort of, I don't have to tell you that much about me, and there's much more to me than the LGBTQ sort of labels.
Confidence in the word queer, isn't there, as well? It suggests that you're quite confident in your position. I think I've got some friends who identify as queer and are very, very proud to almost use that word provocatively at times.
Oh yeah, absolutely. Because I mean, back in the day, queer was used as a derogatory term for gay people, and it's kind of that thing where you own it and you kind of say, oh yeah, I'm queer, and I think you don't have to tell everybody everything about yourself, because as you would have heard from Jack's talk, there is a massive spectrum of not just sexual relationships, but romantic relationships. So, people might have a different sort of identifying. So they might say, okay, I'm bisexual, but homo-romantic, or, there are all sorts of interconnected different ideas of what makes you. So I quite like the term queer. But I think one thing that I would say is probably don't get too caught up on language, because it's really easy to stifle conversations because you're worried about saying the wrong word, you're worried about saying the wrong thing. And as you said, Mark, most people are not doing it intentionally. Most people are doing it because with the best of intentions. So I would say to anybody, please don't worry too much about using exactly the right words. I mean, even as a gay person, I sometimes worry about using the right words for transgender people or non-binary people, and it's difficult, but it shouldn't stop a conversation. The most important thing is that people talk openly, and that you show that you're supportive of our community. So, and believe me, if a woman doesn't want to use the word gay and prefers to use the term lesbian, they'll tell you, and it shouldn't be awkward. They'll just say, oh, I prefer this, and if somebody says that to you, try and remember it for future conversations. But for me, I'm absolutely fine with the word gay.
Yeah, I know, I agree with that. Just to echo that, it's one thing I say quite a lot to people. Those of you who know me a bit better will know I don't necessarily always think, I perhaps always get the right word or the most politically correct word in the correct conversation. But as long as there's no malice behind it, as long as you're speaking genuinely, just treat it as a learning experience, really. People have got to accept that we, don't all have the weight of knowledge or background to understand that in certain circumstances, certain words might not be something that, and it might just be an individual choice as well, hadn't it, where a particular word is not one somebody favors. So I think that really is part of the understanding and talking to each other point. So moving on, so being LGBTQ plus is really a personal thing. So Gareth, how does it why should it affect, or how does it impact you at work?
A bit like we were saying, Mark, it's a bit of an ongoing thing. In theory, it shouldn't impact you at work. In theory, it's a personal life choice, but it's about the individual. Kind of picking up on what Kerry is saying, just whenever you're actually dealing with it or talking about it or having a conversation, there's an element of, and I hate to use the word common sense. Some people are more comfortable being gay, and that's part of their personality. Some people aren't. Some people would rather their work be their work and their personal life, whether that be gay or otherwise, be separate. Like me personally, I'm very much out and very much confident of like expressing my sexuality in work or wherever, whereas other people aren't. So it's just a bit going back to what you're saying. It's not trying to get it right, but just having a conversation and having the right attitude in that conversation to read social cues. Like as Kerry says, if someone's uncomfortable with the word gay or lesbian, they'll tell you. And it's actually just having the good manners, common sense, and just kind of social awareness to pick up on those cues, and then just to adapt it accordingly. Like if you meet me in the firm, I'll probably tell you what I got up to last Pride when we were allowed to do it, whereas other people wouldn't be so forthcoming. So it's just actually just gauging as you go. But yeah, there's no right or wrong answer, no hard or fast rule in that. Subject to disclaimer: read the firm's policy and what is it or isn't appropriate to talk about at work. But it's a very, very bespoke and very individual, and we're different people are at in their own journey, in their own comfortableness, in their own skin. Like, and that's just not something you can teach, just something you just try to be aware of and just try your best to navigate through, because it is a bit of a minefield.
Matt, do you agree we should be talking about it in the workplace?
I think I very much agree with Gareth. Your work is your work. It shouldn't impact on, and it shouldn't affect your ability to do your job. And I think if the environment is such that you feel very uncomfortable and that impacts on your work, obviously that's not a good thing. But invariably, discussions take place every Monday. What did you get up to at the weekend? Oh, I went shopping with my husband, or I went to the garden centre. When we're eventually allowed to do all that sort of stuff all of the time. And if you don't feel that you can say that you went somewhere because you fear the follow-up question is, oh, who did you go there with? And you don't want to then come out and say, oh, I went with my partner, and leave it as vague as that. It can hinder your ability to get involved in those sort of conversations. And certainly years ago, that did stop me talking about my personal life at work almost entirely, because there is no way I could engage with them without coming out. And I didn't want to face those sort of questions at work, because I really did think, particularly as a trainee, particularly as a newly qualified solicitor, I thought that it would impact my ability to progress in my career. With the career as it was, and the firm that I was with, and the sort of attitudes that I knew were floating around at the time, I genuinely thought that would be a problem. So I just didn't discuss it at all. And that's not healthy at all. That's not a healthy place to be in. So yes, I do think that it should be discussed at work, but to the extent that you want to, in exactly the same way that a straight person decides how much of their personal life they disclose about at work as well, there shouldn't be any difference between the two. As long as the environment is a comfortable one in which you feel that you can talk about it if you want, then I think the firm will have achieved what it needs to.
I think that's the key, isn't it? What's the difference, really? If you go to a garden centre with your husband, or you go to a garden centre with your wife, or you go alone, I mean, it's a story, isn't it? Ultimately, an experience. So what does it matter? So Jack, is it ever okay to ask personal questions at work? Would it be okay for me to ask you if you were gay?
Yeah, well, I think it depends on, I think generally for me, it's fine. But I think obviously depending on the person, I think is it ever okay? Yes. Is it always okay? Probably not. Would be my answer. I think it depends.
So that presents us with a dilemma then. How do we know? How does somebody like me say I was curious, I wanted to ask you if you were gay. I probably wouldn't, as it happens, because I as a personal choice. But how would I know whether it was right or wrong, or would I just have to risk it, so to speak? I'd be reading the firm's policies and all of that.
I suppose from my point of view, it kind of depends on your relationship with the person and the reason why you're asking. If there's no malice there, then I don't think, for me personally, there's any harm in asking, although obviously depending on why. It's it's obviously a grey area, really, but for me, I've got no problems with being asked myself. But yeah.
So where do you think we should draw the line, Kerry?
It is hard. It is a bit of a grey area, because I know there are a lot of people out there who probably think, somebody said this to me the other day. I was doing a talk for women in IP about disability in the workplace, and this lady said, I was also really open about the fact that I was gay, and she's like, I think I work with a guy who might be gay. Can I ask him? And I just said, no, I don't think you should be able to ask. I mean, it probably is, as Jack said, can you ask? Maybe sometimes. Should you always ask? No. And for me, I probably just think, just don't ask, because if it really doesn't make a difference, then you don't need to know.
I think that's where ultimately I'd get to, as in, what difference does it make, really, unless it was actually something that was relevant to what you were talking about, or the series of conversations you've had. Is it really something that, say, to stick with the question, are you gay, are there really that many circumstances where where you actually I've never asked anybody in their life if they're straight, so why, what difference does it make? I
think there's a danger sometimes. If you're a team leader, maybe you think that somebody in your team is not necessarily happy at work because you feel that they're not able to be open and to be out, and that happens. But I still don't think the right thing to do, if you are concerned about a colleague, is to ask them. What I would do is just show as openly as you can that you're an ally. So you can do that in loads of different ways. You can go to pride marches, which, by the way, are awesome, so everybody should do that. You can watch relevant TV programs, like It's a Sin was a really hard-hitting but amazing
it was really
drama.
good, actually. I really enjoyed that.
Yeah. I mean, it opens a lot of people's eyes about the history of particularly gay men during the AIDS pandemic, and it's hard watching, but people just had to watch it, and I think it's quite emotive. So, and if you watch a program like that, talk about it at work. There's no reason why we shouldn't talk about that. So, and you could have a little rainbow flag on your desk or whatever you want to do. And this month, actually, we're encouraging people to put on their team's profile that they're an LGBT ally, if that's what they want to do, because it just is a little marker of saying, I'm a safe space here. So if that person later chooses that they want to come out, then they can do. But coming out is so personal, and people will do it for their own reasons at their own time. So I don't know. I would, to be safe, I would say I don't think it's ever really okay to ask at work.
Yeah. So I'm going to stick with you, Kerry. What does intersectionality mean, and how does it affect your personal experience?
So I'm going to read from my thing, because I had to write this down. I want to get this right. So basically, intersectionality.
I had to practice saying the word intersectionality, so you've got nothing to worry about.
My other half last night kept saying intersexuality, and I was like, it's not that. Like, just don't make words up. So intersectionality is essentially where people have different personal characteristics that overlap. So everybody has all sorts of intersectional characteristics, but I think where it's most relevant is where somebody maybe has an identifying characteristic that that they're worried that they might suffer any prejudice. So, for example, somebody might identify as being disabled and as being gay, and that's an intersection between those two personal characteristics. Somebody might identify as being gay and also be Black, and they're two intersectional characteristics. I identify as gay and I'm a woman. Again, they're two intersecting characteristics. So it's kind of where these two things meet. And if you think about it, everybody has a gender, everybody has a sexuality, everybody has an ethnicity. So we all have it, and there's no sort of magic behind it. It's just where these characteristics cross and overlap. But it's really important that we understand people's experiences of intersectionality, because essentially we want to understand how people in society might experience things like discrimination or privilege, because both of those things are important and affect how other people experience the world. So that's what it is. I can talk a little bit about my experience of, like, personally, of intersectionality, but also my understanding of other people's experience of intersectionality. So, for example, my ex-partner was disabled and gay, and I know that she struggled a lot in work, and you know, not really for being gay. She was absolutely fine to be out, but her disability meant that the workplace had some barriers that weren't necessarily fair. And then I had friends who are Black, and they talk about, yeah, okay, I'm gay, but also what's another really important part of my identity is the fact that I'm Black, and you know, I want people to understand that at school that things were said to me that are not acceptable, and that's before I even told anybody I was gay. So I already felt sort of vulnerable in that way. So it's sort of understanding how these things work together. And so an example for me in my intersectionality and how it affected me is I was working for a law firm a few years ago, and basically we were getting an expert witness on board, and we realized that this expert witness couldn't act for our client because he was a friend of the opposing party, and the partner in the law firm asked me what my husband would think about that situation, because we were having a little debate about whether this expert should be able to act, and he said, well, what would your husband think? And I think I was offended, both because he assumed that because I was married I had a husband, and also that my husband's opinion was more important than my opinion. So that conversation was really awkward. I had to explain that I could be married and not have a husband, unfortunately. So yeah, again, it's things that little things that happen where you kind of like everything affects you. So just looking at people's experiences of the world, and intersectionality is a huge part of that.
That's useful. Is there any language, Matt, that we should be conscious of using in the workplace, or any common examples to illustrate that?
I think we've talked quite a lot about the uses of certain language, and I think ultimately it boils down often to intent and context. Queer is a word that I'd sort of got in the back of my head to mention, because I myself, when I'm using that term within or amongst other people who identify or would identify as queer, I find that quite an empowering word, and it's used a lot of pride. It's shouted at the rooftops, and it has been sort of, if you like, taken back by the community and used in that way. But equally, I know that if anybody is looking to offend somebody in the community, that's probably the go-to word that they would still use, that or the obvious sort of fag, homo, all of those sorts of words, which, you know, of course, avoid them like the plague. There's often very few contexts where somebody outside the community can use those sorts of words without any malice behind them. So I think it really does boil down to your relationship with the person you're using the words with, in exactly the same way as the sort of training that we have on like equality and diversity. If you're close friends with somebody, you can use language and you make a judgment call as to whether or not it's appropriate. And if you don't know the people you're around, just be more mindful of the sorts of things you do use and the sorts of language you do come out with. Generally speaking, I wouldn't want to speak to it for anybody that's in the trans community, but the word transsexual or referring to somebody as a transsexual is not something often that is done anymore. That is in itself often seen as quite a derogatory term, or sort of a way of singling out that person as something, whereas referring to them potentially as he is trans or she is trans is sort of more neutral language that people are encouraged to use. But in exactly the same way you said, Mark, it is an education piece. None of us get it right all of the time. And if you feel that you have said something that you've offended somebody, just bring it back in and sort of say, oh, is that the right term? I apologize if I've got that wrong, and allow that person then to have an open discussion with you about what sort of terminology you should use.
And I think it's equally important that the person who has faced that language or been the recipient of something they feel uncomfortable with feels that they can challenge it, because I think it's a two-way process, isn't it, really? Because if you don't challenge it, and I appreciate that's a personal choice ultimately, if you don't challenge it, the person who's used the language won't know that it's something that's caused offense, because in some cases it will, let's be honest, in some cases it will be used in life to offend people. You use the example of the word queer. I've been involved in situations where that word has been used very negatively and very positively, but I think in the vast majority of cases, I don't think there's any harmful intent in what people are saying. We're all trying to get along, really, aren't we, and understand a bit more.
Yeah, and I do start from the position that most people are not out there to offend people, and would be mortified if they later found out after the discussion 2 days later that they had, and they're not then in that mindset or that scenario to go back and, like I said, open that discussion. It's often harder to sort of tread over old ground and things have already been said and assumptions have already been made. So I do, and most people I know that I speak to that are gay or lesbian or trans, they start from the same position, but invariably there are people that will use this language as a derogatory way. They will use it to offend, they will use it to incite discussion that's hateful, but we're hoping that those sorts of people are not the sort of people that would come and work at Shakespeare Martineau and other workworkplaces. And in the wider community, hopefully those attitudes are dying out as well.
Yeah. So you mentioned assumption there. I'm going to come to Jack and Gareth on this one. Gareth first. What's the worst assumption someone has made about you once they found out you're LGBTQ plus? And has anyone ever changed their behavior around you as a consequence? Gareth.
The worst assumption is the lack of a desire for an actual conventional relationship. Worst assumption is there's a lot of stigma in the community that particularly as gay men, I suspect gay women or lesbian women have the same, that it's very fake, or it's very disposable, and nobody really wants to have a long-term relationship or wants to get married or have kids. Thankfully that image and that misconception is passing. I think it's just a historic thing. So that personally, that's the worst assumption, because all that I ever wanted is a husband, house, and kids. And pretty much like any other straight person, like that's what I want in life. Have I ever kind of had have I ever had an adverse impact for being gay? No. I've actually been quite fortunate. So I was actually apprehensive about joining this panel because I genuinely, maybe it's just the way that I'm wired, I've never had any adverse effect of being gay in life. So sometimes I come at this very rainbow and sunshine, which isn't necessarily a good thing, because it is about raising awareness of where people feel and trying to make it better and be better allies and all the rest. But personally, and that's not just company speak, even within the firm, I've always been, and not to blow, excuse my language, not to blow smoke up your proverbial rear, Mark, you've also always been a very good champion of the wider community. And I've always felt kind of supported within the firm, always, like from day one. And I've been with the firm since 2006, but recently, as I said earlier, it's become more of a conversation. But previously, there was never any malice or never any negativity. It just wasn't necessarily openly spoke about, but I always felt supported. Whereas more recently, it's more spoke about. So therefore, people are actually not as confident, perhaps, as I am, can feel more confident coming out.
I would say, having worked with you for a lot of years now, it's so natural talking to you, and it's so much part of you that it almost seems, I wouldn't say irrelevant's the wrong word, I'm not thinking of the right word, but it's almost so natural in terms of talking to you about whether you talk to you about issues which would be relevant to it or not. It's just part of a normal conversation. I think that's where we need to get to, really, where just the same as you might ask how my kids are or how Susan is or whatever, it's just part of the normal conversation to the extent that you know somebody. Jack, how about you?
Very similar to Gareth, to be fair. I've not really had any adverse impacts really that I can think of about coming out, but I think actually similar to Gareth, it's actually from family members about not having children or not wanting to pursue like get married or things like that, and that has really been something that's affected me. But obviously, like Gareth, that's something that I really do want to do. I want to have children, want to get married, but that was something that I did have to talk about when I came out. So yeah, definitely can understand that.
Kerry, have you ever experienced tokenism or bias?
Not so far as I'm aware. Not so far as I'm aware, but then bias is one of those
Not even
things.
being the token woman on the panel. Only kidding. Only kidding.
Oh, I'm going to go there. No,
I'm not even going to say that.
So I think bias is one of those things that sort of is not always conscious and not something that even the person who has the bias is aware of. And we all know that we all have unconscious biases that we need to try and become aware of and challenge a little bit. So I don't know that I have, but I might have. So I really don't know. But with tokenism, what does make me laugh, and it's absolutely fine, it doesn't offend me, it doesn't upset me, is if there is an LGBTQ event going on, I normally get asked to go to it, and that's absolutely fine, because I started up More in Common. I am so interested in any event, whether it's an LGBTQ event or any other event to do with diversity. I'm always up for going to them.
So I started getting, even before the People's Champion thing, I started getting asked to go to that sort of thing. I was quite pleased, really, because it sort of felt as if people were asking me because they thought that it's something I would just naturally consider going to, and it just sort of felt as if I was quite proud of it in a funny sort of way, without overstating it. And I think it's really good. I always think if I've got something like that coming, and there's more of that now, we're looking at the People's Champions within this area, there's more of that. I'm always quite conscious of actually trying to send an invitation on to a wide variety of people, because I quite like to send it to people who might be the last person who wants to go. So they might come back to me and say, well, why have you sent this to me? Because I think that in itself can lead to quite an interesting conversation at times. I think that's a really interesting point. So for all of us striving, and hopefully it'll be all of us, or the vast majority of us, striving to be better allies, what can or should we be doing, Gareth, to more support people in the LGBTQ plus community?
I think it's kind of the theme even of this conversation. It's probably around, as Matt said, the education piece. Like, even being on this call right now, I've learned things like I didn't know of that term ACE in the LGBT spectrum. I had never heard of intersectionality. I'm not sure the right pronunciation of that. But like, whether you be within the community or outside the community, it's actually just about educated and actually just creating, as I think it was Kerry said earlier, back to the conversation, is it okay to ask someone if they're gay? It's about creating a safe environment. You don't actually have to ask the question, because like, it's almost like, I don't mean it patronizing, but it's almost like dealing with children. If you be direct, you almost push away. Whereas if you actually create a space to let someone see that it's safe, they normally flourish in it. And it's slightly probably more difficult when it's someone senior and someone junior, but when people at your own peer level, it's about creating a safe environment, whether that be socially or within work or whatever, creating an environment where whoever you're dealing with, if you actually think they are perhaps struggling or questioning or whatever, creating an environment where they can actually just break through and actually just that they're comfortable. Because ultimately, as we touched on earlier, it really doesn't matter as long as people are comfortable, whether they're being out or not out. As long as they're that's all that matters, that they feel included or feel safe. So ultimately, just educate yourself, and as Kerr said, try not to stifle the conversation. Try not to try to get it perfect. Just have the conversation and actually just keep the conversation going and actually just be supportive. And again, overarching, not necessarily just LGBTQ, whatever issues are going on in people's life. Like, I know we're talking specifically on that issue today, but everybody's got a whole range of kind of pressures or concerns at home. Just be supportive in the best way that you know how. Talk, cup of tea, go out, catch up.
And I think just to build on that, the firm's participation in the Pride March in Birmingham in September, it was cancelled, it's been postponed, but the number of people I've had say, just from the More in Common group in particular, it hasn't been released yet to sort of the wider firm as such yet, but the number of people who've come back to me and said, that's great, I'm going to come, can I bring my son, can I bring my daughter, can I bring my husband, and that is exactly the sort of thing that we want to encourage, and I think is such a we've had more requests this year for people to come. I think it's going to be a really good event, and if you can, please do sign up.
I totally agree with you. That's a very powerful message in a very subtle way. I mean, that's not necessarily someone directly asking.
It's not subtle.
I think
the Pride March is necessarily associated with being subtle, is it, Gareth?
Well, but I mean, it's like when you have allies attending it, it's just them sending a subtle message that
I get what you mean.
They're not uncomfortable with it. They're part of the journey with you.
So I'm going to ask one final question to all of you. So going back to the time where you're first questioning about what should I come out, should I tell, should I this, that, or the other, all the challenges which we've talked about. What would you tell your younger selves looking back on it from where you are now? Start with Jack.
So I think the biggest thing I've taken away from it is that people largely react positively. And I didn't really anticipate that before I told people. I mean, some people did at times didn't react initially well, but then came around to it kind of thing. But I think my real take from it is that those that mind don't matter and those that matter don't mind. Is something that I've really taken from my experience.
Matt?
On similar lines, I'd say don't underestimate how much people do care about you as a person. I think when I was laying in bed worrying about coming out to family, coming out to friends, I thought once I'd done that, I'd have no family, I'd have no friends, I'd be starting from scratch, I'd have to run away to London and find a new community to be a part of. And my experience, fortunately for me, and it's not the same for everybody, was that actually none of that happened at all. And the only sort of hint of it that I had at a previous workplace in the work environment was I definitely had a little bit of change of attitude. But as I grew older, as I grew more confident, those sorts of opinions didn't matter to me then. And I wish I could have sort of known that as a 13, 14-year-old, that I would soon have those attitudes.
Kerry?
So I was quite fortunate. I always knew that my mum and dad would be fine about it, and I think the person who wasn't fine about it was me. And it's so true that, you know, you grow up in a world where you experience stuff and it's all quite subtle, and you start to feel like an outsider before you've ever come out, and you kind of hide it sometimes. Not everybody does, but I did. And I knew that everybody would be fine, but I wasn't fine. So if I could change it coming out, I think that I would have talked to people a little bit more. So I would say to them, I'm gay and I don't want to talk about it. And sort of that's how I was in my 20s. And I wish that I'd spoken to people, especially to my mum, because I told her and then ran away to Nottingham that day. And just as she called me, she kept calling me. She really wanted to have a conversation. And I was like, I don't want to talk about it. But, you know, I was probably just a bit of a teenage attitude. But I think the most important word you can say to somebody is that they matter. You know, you matter. So however you identify, and whatever your background, you are important to the people around you. And what I would also say to other people who aren't as fortunate as I was, knowing that I had a supportive family and friends, is even if your family and friends are not supportive, there are people out there who are. So you've got to find them. And if you're at Shakespeare Martineau and you want to find your allies, we're here, we're all here, and you can talk to us. You're completely not on your own. So I appreciate everybody's experience is difficult, but it's just important for everybody to know that they do matter.
Gareth?
Following the same theme, if I could talk to a younger self, it is actually just pluck up the courage and do it earlier. Like, I might come across quite confident now, but like everyone else, that decision to actually step over the line and come out is actually quite a big one. And at the time, it seemed like the end of the world, and like kind of echoing what everyone said, it's as if it was going to have some massive impact in your life, and in real terms, it doesn't. Because if for whatever reason, I know it's very simplistic to say, but if for whatever reason your family discard or whatever, there is a whole world of people out there that are accepting, including our firm. So it's, if I could speak to a younger self, I'd be like, take the courage and dispense with the 3 to 5 angry years of frustration of being in a closet trying to be straight, and just be yourself, like using our own hashtag, be yourself as soon as possible, within reason, but as soon as possible.
So I'm going to add to that. So from a slightly, a different perspective, I suppose. So what I would tell my younger self going back, I started off being incredibly old now, in a workplace where there were different tolerances or lack of tolerances. And I really wished I'd have challenged it looking back on. I didn't actually join in with the stuff, but I certainly didn't necessarily challenge it because I was probably frightened to do so, particularly when it was your senior partners. There was somebody I can remember who was gay, openly defined themselves as gay in the firm, and it became a standard joke. Every time you mentioned him, somebody had to mention, a story about the fact that he was gay, and normally a sort of semi-derogatory one, really, if that makes sense. And I always felt uncomfortable with that, but you let it go because you think, what would be the consequences? Would I be picked on next and whatever? And I think if you bring that into the modern age, I think people like me and the rest of our community have got to challenge anything which, even if at times we feel uncomfortable doing so, I think it's important not to let things go and not to put up with intolerance wherever it is. I think not just in this setting. And I think the more we can all do that from our different perspectives, the better community we will be, really, because we're not there yet. I think it's far more refreshing. I've seen over 30 or so years how the firm's developed, in terms of its attitudes towards all sorts of things, and it's a much more positive firm to be in, in 2021 than it is. But we've got a long way to go yet, because we've got to make sure we aren't guilty of tokenism. We've got to make sure we really do listen and that we do have these conversations. So I'll end on that, and thank you all for your time and for your input. I think certainly from my perspective, it's been very illuminating, and to encourage anyone watching this to challenge, to listen, to become part of this journey, because we've all got a part to play. And wouldn't it be lovely if we didn't have to even think of having these conversations, because it all became so natural. And it is not just in this space, but it's around the firm as a whole with all the issues we face. So thank you very much for your time, and enjoy Pride Month.